Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast with Tad Glibert is a powerful one, and I can't wait for you to hear it. But before we get to Tad's story, I want to tell you about a project we've been doing for a couple weeks now with Express Feedback for Good. We've partnered with them on an initiative to generate up to $50,000 for Sports Spectrum. And what they do is they're a platform for individuals to support organizations that they care about. It allows you to quickly and easily share an opinion about a brand that's relevant to you. And when you give that opinion, it creates funding for Sports Spectrum. Sharing more opinions creates more funding. It's that simple. So I just want to encourage you guys to check it out because there's no gimmicks here. When you join Express Feedback for Good, your personal information is kept confidential. It's totally free. It doesn't cost you a single dime. But when you leave that feedback, when you give that opinion with Express Feedback for Good, it helps raise funds for Sports Spectrum, and those funds allow us to continue spreading the gospel through the lens of sports. Here's how you can do it. Go to sportsspectrum.com, our website. You can sign up there, or simply text EFG, the letters EFG, to 31996. It's a great program. It'll help us gain more funds to be able to tell more stories like Tad Glibert's. Please consider being a part of Express Feedback for Good. Today on the podcast, we welcome Tad Glibert to the show. Tad is the former Assistant Director of Operations for the Northwestern University men's basketball program. Tad and his wife Carly, in 2018, took a missions trip to Malawi in Africa, and they escaped an armed robbery on this missions trip. And it's a pretty crazy story that Tad will share here on the podcast. Tad went to Indiana Wesleyan for his undergrad and played soccer there. We had Greg Tonigal, the Indiana Wesleyan basketball coach, on the podcast about a year and a half ago. And Indiana Wesleyan has a pretty great thing going on over there as they glorify God through college and certainly through their athletics with the I Am Third model. And Tad, while he was an undergrad, interned in the athletic department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then went to Northwestern for his master's degree and was a grad assistant there until he got hired full-time on staff when he was just 23 and has worked there for the past 5 years. And we all wrestle with that moment where we realize God is calling us to do something for him. Could be something small, could be something big, could be, something where we just need to be obedient in our giving. Maybe it's just serving in some sort of ministry at church or whatever. And sometimes he calls us to do really, really, really big things, like leave your job, your very comfortable job in Chicago, Illinois, and move all the way to Africa and become a full-time missionary. That's what's happened here with Tad Glibert. His story, it's a pretty great one. Take a listen to Tad Glibert's story here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. Tad, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk and kind of share my story and how God has led me from the basketball world to the missions world.
Yeah, Tad, your story is amazing, and I'm really happy you're here. Thanks for joining us, and really excited to talk to you. Let's learn about you first, because there's a whole level of things and stories and what God is doing really in the next couple of days that's taken you into a new transition, into a new way of life in many ways. But let's learn about you first, Tad. Share with us about growing up, where you're from, and kind of the role maybe sports played in your life.
Yeah. So originally I'm from a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, where sports was a big part of my life. I grew up really in love with basketball. My family had season tickets to Ohio State, and so I really loved college basketball, specifically the Big Ten. And so it's always been a dream of mine to be part of a Big Ten program. But the Lord blessed me with soccer ability and not basketball ability. And so he led me to Indiana Wesleyan University, where I played soccer. And, that was a big pivotal part of my life and my spiritual growth. I know you've been to Indiana Wesleyan, you know that God's presence is very real on that campus. And
Yes.
so that was a very, very pivotal part of my spiritual journey. After I was at Indiana Wesleyan, I interned at the University of North Carolina in their athletic department, which was really big for my career because it showed me the insides of how a Power 5, college athletic department worked. And that's something that like I said, I had a dream always to be part of a big program like that. And I was fortunate enough to be hired on the men's basketball staff as a grad assistant at Northwestern. And then after my first year as a grad assistant, they hired me on full time as the assistant director of basketball operations. And that's kind of what I've been doing ever since I finished college.
So you could say you made it to the Division I basketball level. You just weren't playing, right?
Yeah. And you talk to a lot of coaches, they say, oh, has it always been a dream of yours to coach? And a lot of them say, no, I wanted to play professional basketball. And I was kind of a little bit different because I feel like as a kid, I always had a dream to coach in Division I basketball. And never really, I think I knew the reality that I probably wasn't going to make it to the NBA. And so at a young age, I kind of realized that coaching was something right up my alley.
Now, faith, obviously we intersect sports and faith on this podcast. So where does your faith come from? You mentioned Indiana Wesleyan, so I have to imagine you were a believer before going there, but take us through sort of the progression of your faith growing up and kind of before you take this sort of next step where your faith has kind of brought you to.
Yeah. So I grew up in the church, but I don't think I really had a real relationship with Jesus until I got to Indiana Wesleyan. Indiana Wesleyan wasn't even really on my radar of a school to go to. I had a lot of other bigger schools recruiting me. But my club coach, who was a Christian college coach as well, he kind of approached me one day and was like, hey, like, where are you at in your decision? And I was like, I don't know. I'm going back and forth on what school I should pick. And he's like, have you ever thought about going to a Christian school? And I was like, no, not really. And so he listed a couple of schools that he knew the coaches at that he thought would be maybe a good fit for me. And I literally picked Indiana Wesleyan because it was the closest one to my hometown. And my parents didn't want to fly me across the country if we weren't really sure if I was going to go to a Christian school or not. And so when I went there, I just experienced God's love in a different way and knew that was the place for me. And so, yeah, when I got there, my spiritual kind of growth just really took off. When you're surrounded by professors, by coaches, by teammates, by classmates that really love Jesus, it really grows on you. And that was a big part, like I said, of my spiritual growth. And it's kind of just keep going up since then.
Yeah, I was privileged, you mentioned this, to go to Indiana Wesleyan last year and speak at their chapel and kind of talk to their sports teams, their basketball team. But I was so impressed with the presence, as you said, of the Spirit on campus, but how, there are a lot of Christian schools, I think, that might just, they say they're Christian and then you go and it's just like any other college campus. But there's something different about Indiana Wesleyan. When you go, you're on a college campus, but you see that the intentionality, the openly, I guess, unashamed way that they proclaim the gospel, and not just, when you're walking around campus, but when you're inside the locker room, which I got to be for the Indiana Wesleyan basketball team. I saw I am third as the model, and I saw, Jesus first, others second, ourselves third. I saw them praying. I saw them modeling it. So you being around that campus, playing soccer there and just kind of being around that atmosphere, you can attest to that too, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm friends with those coaches. They're still there. The ones on the basketball team specifically. I mean, those guys are the real deal. I mean, talk about being able to compete at the highest level and winning national championships, but also being able to mentor and disciple young men and really allow them to build a firm foundation in Jesus that will take off for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it's super impressive. Greg Tonigal and Jeff Clark are the two that come to my mind of guys that are just the real deal. Coach Tonigal was a guest on this podcast if you want to hear more about Indiana Wesleyan. Tad Glibert is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. All right, so you're at Northwestern. You get that job, you get that role, and suddenly missions becomes something you're passionate about, which will lead us to where, God is calling you next. Why don't you take us through kind of when missions became first a big part of your life and something that would eventually change your life?
Yeah. So my wife, actually, she has been involved with an organization called Circle of Hope International, which is based out of Wilmore, Kentucky, but runs a place called the Grace Center in rural Malawi, Africa. And for those of you who don't know about Malawi, it's on the southeast side of Africa. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, and the Grace Center is located in a rural area, so it's like the poorest of the poor. And she got involved in 2012 when she was a nursing major and kind of doing medical missions, and fell in love immediately. And that's she just had been going back year after year after year. And I finally got to go in 2017. And the big thing I think God spoke to me during that trip was he really just showed me his heart for the poor and the vulnerable and how he cares for them. And so I fell in love immediately when I got there, fell in love with the people, fell in love with the culture. And then I knew I was going to go back in 2018. But right before our trip in 2018, the Malawian pastor who kind of ran the Grace Center had died unexpectedly. And so there was a lot of uncertainty on, who was going to lead and, the direction of the center. And so we got there, and a couple of days later, in the middle of the night, we were robbed by about 15 to 20 men with clubs and machetes. There's a house that some people stay in, and then some of us stay in tents outside. And so kind of take you through that experience. My wife and I woke up in our tent in the middle of the night to this awful noise. And you kind of hear noises in Africa. There's just, wild animals all over. And so it's not uncommon to hear, weird noises in the middle of the night, but there was something different about this one. And, later on we found out it was one of the guards. He had been cut with a machete, and he was basically screaming and running away. And so we woke up, we knew something was wrong. Then we started hearing glass break from inside the house. We started hearing the doors being broken down. But, God really protected us during that night. When we started piecing everything together after the fact, we had set up a tent the night before because we had more team members coming the next day. And we don't even really know why we set it up. Like we just set it up, and that's the tent that got sliced into. And I think the robbers looked in and, didn't see anything. So they didn't come to my tent. They didn't come to the other tents that were outside. They broke into every room inside the house except the one that the director of the organization was staying in. It had all of our passports, all of our money. And so, as awful of an experience it was, God really protected us during that time. And so for the rest of that trip, we had to stay in a hotel in the capital and drive about an hour to the center every day. And during that time at the hotel, I very clearly heard God call my wife and I to move to Malawi, which was a very, very confusing request, because I had no desire to become a missionary. I had no desire to live overseas. Like I said, there was a lot of uncertainty with safety and leadership of the Grace Center. And so we just kind of started praying through that process for the next couple months. And, to be honest, after I felt like I heard a yes from the Lord, I didn't immediately pull the trigger. I was a little hesitant. And I think the reason was because, the world is kind of telling me it doesn't make sense to leave your job at Northwestern to live in one of the poorest countries in the world, especially after what you had just experienced. And, I think you probably went through a similar situation when you were thinking about leaving ESPN to come to Sports Spectrum, but you kind of sense that greater calling into ministry. And so that's something the Lord really like laid on my heart is, when society and culture tells you to go one way and Jesus tells you to go another way, like you got to make a choice. And so we ultimately said yes. And, we've kind of been going through this process for the last 6 months or so of getting prepared. And we're going to leave here in a couple of days to become the first full-time missionaries kind of in this whole area of Malawi. And so it's really exciting.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm glad you said it all there, because now we can kind of dive in, because a lot of the questions I have were, questions about the robbery and all that took place and why were you leaving. So let's go back a little bit. So this robbery happens when you're there, and you experience it. You're going through. You end up at a hotel, but I'm wondering faith-wise, you saw God see you through it, and a lot of the situations that you look back, you were like, okay, God clearly had his hand on this, but fear is a liar, as the song says, but at the same time, it's a very real thing that we all struggle and go through. Talk about fear a little bit, Tad, and just overcoming that, not having that consume you, because I think a lot of people listening might be like, all right, if I'm going to be in a place in Africa in the middle of nowhere and these people are going to rob us, I'm not going back there, and you're going back there, but not just to visit. You are actually going to be a full-time missionary there. So talk about fear a little bit.
Yeah. Fear is definitely something that is real. But I think the whole part of this whole process that, the Lord's really been speaking to my heart is kind of trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And so, fear, like I said, is a very real thing. It's definitely just part of, I think, the process of doing anything, when you're taking a step of faith, a leap of faith. Fear is always going to be kind of dwindling in the background a little bit, but I think our trust for the Lord and the plan that he has for our lives is so much greater than that. And so, like I said, we're really excited, a little bit nervous. It's the first time that we're going through this process. It's also the first time for Circle of Hope to go through this process. It's the first time for the Malawians that are living there to go through this process. And so, we're really excited to get started.
What's the state of faith, I guess, in Malawi? Obviously, I'm sure there's some resistance, and then there's other places that are more open. So what does that sort of faith element look like in Malawi?
Yeah, religion is a big part of their life. I don't think they're consumed with some of the stuff that we have in America that kind of blinds faith. They are very, very trusting in some sort of religion. So it's about a third Christian, a third Muslim, and then a third traditional religion, which is like witchcraft and things like that. And we actually have a lot of kids at our orphanage that families kind of forced them to get into the witchcraft religion, and they didn't want to do it. And so they were kind of kicked out of their homes, and that's why they are living at our orphanage. But and where we are, Jesus is definitely the foundation of the Grace Center, and people have definitely bought in, and that's a big part of, like I said, who we are and what we do.
We'll get back to our conversation with Tad Glibert in just a moment, but want to stop for 1 second and pause and tell you about our friends at Express Feedback for Good. This is a program that we launched a couple weeks ago, and it's an opportunity for you to support causes that you care about by sharing feedback on the brands that you interact with through Express Feedback for Good. They've partnered with us. Here's how it works. As a fan of Sports Spectrum and this podcast, you can join Express Feedback for Good and share feedback on brands that matter to you. Each time you give a piece of feedback, which takes less than a minute, your opinion helps create financial impact for us here at Sports Spectrum. It's really that easy. So I'd like you to consider supporting our ministry with Express Feedback for Good. The program started October 14th, runs for 30 days. It's totally free to you, and your personal information is kept confidential. You can sign up by visiting sportspectrum.com. You can go to any of our social media channels, Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, or you can simply text us, EFG, text the letters EFG, to 31996. Working together, we can create up to $50,000 of funding for Sports Spectrum, which we'll use to continue spreading the gospel through the lens of sport. Let's get back to our conversation now with Tad Glibert here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. Tell me about Carly a little bit and just the impact that she's had personally for you, because I could see this. I'm just imagining if this was my wife coming to me and wanting to move to Malawi, and I would be resistant to that. In many ways, even after it feels or is clearly aware that God is the one speaking to me. So tell me about Carly a little bit and just the impact she's had. And you said she started going in 2012, so 7 years ago,
Yep.
and it really wasn't until 2 years ago that you went. So obviously she's had a huge impact on you and this whole decision.
Yeah, like I said, she started going in 2012 when she was a nursing student, and she, like I said, she fell in love with it. She started going back year after year. She joined the board of directors for the organization, so she's very involved with what is going on at the Grace Center and with Circle of Hope International. And she was a big part of getting our medical clinic up and running, which as of January. Is up and running every single day, gives affordable health care for the people in the community, because that's a big thing that they were missing. And so we've seen a lot of growth in the community just by having that on our campus. But yeah, she was praying back in 2013 before we got engaged about moving to Malawi. And, usually when you offer something like that up to the Lord, he'll take you up on it. But she very clearly heard him say no. And she says, looking back now, she felt like the Lord was saying not yet. And so I think after she heard a no there, she felt like that was probably never going to be a part of her life, moving to Africa, because she knew that's not really what I wanted to do. And so she was really excited when I came to her and said, hey, I think the Lord's leading us to Africa, because it was kind of, pushed in the back of her mind that was ever going to be a possibility. And so she's going to continue to do nursing stuff while she's there. She is going to be a big part of opening up our maternal center, which will allow mothers to come and give birth and get pre and postnatal care, which is big for a community like that, because there's a lot of complication with childbirth. And, a lot of, women either die during the birth process or the child dies during the birth process. So that's a big part of how we are going to help transform the community.
You mentioned, me understanding what you're going through because of the transition of hearing from the Lord. Let me preface this for everybody listening. This is completely different. I basically was leaving a job and taking a pay cut, but I still live in my house in Connecticut, and my wife and daughter are working and still in school, and nothing. Yes, I had to leave the sort of comforts that come with having a job at ESPN, but you're leaving to go to Africa, which is big time different than what I did, at least in my eyes, maybe not in anybody else's. But what was the reaction like when you were telling your friends, your family, about this? Was there any resistance at all? I received a little resistance from some people at ESPN, just like, you're crazy. How could you walk away from this comfort, this amazing job that you have, the benefits? And, there was only a few people that did that. And I clearly knew it was the right move and time to go. What kind of resistance, if any, did you have from people, whether it was at Northwestern, whether it was your family members? What kind of reaction did you get?
Yeah, it was kind of a mixed reaction. A lot of people, did look at us like we were crazy. They're like, really, you're going to leave your job at Northwestern to move 10,000 miles away in one of the poorest countries in the world, especially, after experiencing a robbery like you did. But there was also a lot of people that were very, very supportive because, we have expressed of how big of an impact Africa has had on our life and the people of that community. And so, kind of through that process, I feel like the Lord's really been speaking about, Romans 12, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so, I think society kind of teaches us that we got to have the best of this, got to have the best of that, got to have got to get a promotion, got to make as much money as we can. But the way of Jesus is, downwardly focused, and how can we love and serve others? And so that's, I think, what the Lord's really been teaching me through this whole process.
I have to imagine for this role in leaving and making this decision, it opened up opportunities for you to talk about your faith even more, right? I mean, it did for me, I know. So what were those conversations like? I had to imagine that was kind of a cool aspect in all of this, to be able to, okay, maybe we know that Tad goes to church and that his faith's important, but this is a bigger deal than that.
Yeah, I think it really showed people how committed I was to my faith. Part of the missionary process, becoming a missionary, is you got to raise your own support. And so you're meeting with a lot of different people that are Christians, people that aren't Christians. And so some of those talks aren't the most fun because you're asking people for money, and that can kind of be a little bit of an awkward subject, but it was definitely an opportunity to share, especially with non-believers, our heart for the Lord and what he's called us to do. And I think it did have an impact on, some people, like showing how bold we're being by leaving our comfortable lives in America to follow what God's calling us to do.
So what will it look like when you get to Malawi? Now, we're taping this so people know, September 27th. We're running this in October. You're leaving October 1st to be full-time missionary. What will that look like when you fly out there? I mean, are you literally just taking 3 or 4 bags? Obviously, you can't get a moving truck and just take a U-Haul to Malawi. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so you're very limited on what we can pack to go there. We're basically living in 2 rooms. One's like a kitchen and one's like a bedroom. We don't really have any furniture. It's concrete walls, concrete floor, no air conditioning, no heating. I mean, it's like a little hut, and we actually weren't expecting to get running water. But Circle Hope did a fundraiser, and one of the projects that's going on right now is they're working on getting us a tank stand that will allow us to have running water in our house, which is definitely a luxury where we're going. It's very like minimalistic living, very simple living, but we thought it was important to kind of live as the people of the community live and go through the things that they have to go through. And so it's definitely completely different than, what it's like in America. You're basically eating the same meal every day or similar meal every day.
What kind of meal is that, Tad?
What they eat all the time, it's called sema. And what it is, it's corn flour and water mixed into this kind of like mashed potato-y texture. Okay. And it literally tastes like nothing. So I read somewhere that somebody said it tastes like Elmer's glue, and that's actually probably pretty accurate. It's really just a filler. So they mix that with beans, and that's kind of like their main staple. So if you ever ask somebody from like Malawi, what's your favorite food? They'll say sema and beans, and you're kind of like, what? But when you eat it every day, I guess you learn to like it. So
no chicken, no pizza, no pasta, nothing like that.
No pizza. No pizza, no ice cream, nothing like that. Pasta they can kind of make, but that's like a special occasion every now and then with our kids at the orphanage. We kind of have like a pasta party. There's no really sauce. It's just really the noodles. Chicken, they do have chicken. They can't really come to grips with feeding the chickens, the fattening them up before they kill them and eat them. So it's really like skin and then bone. There's very little meat on the chicken. So you can have that every now and then, but like I said, when you have to feed so many children in a poor area like that, you don't have the luxury to get a lot of protein or things like that. So.
Sure. No, completely understand. Listen, this has been great having you share your story. Tad, I want to give an opportunity to our listeners to be able to partner or help, or this is a missionary. So this is you're relying on funding and help from people and the generosity of others to do this work. So how can people help support you along on this journey with your wife, Carly?
Yeah. So you can either give to us, straight to us as missionaries, or you can give the Circle of Hope International to help us fund some of the projects that we were doing. The website is cohcommunity.org, and on there it'll kind of show you who Circle of Hope is, who we are, and kind of, if you want to give, that's where you can do it. So really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, cohcommunity.org. That'll be great. And who knows? I mean, this will be cool. I know we got a lot of listeners, and it'll be nice to see if they can help along on this journey with you, Tad, and your wife, Carly. All right, let's close it with this. You're leaving in just a few days. You're about to change. Your life's about to change forever. What is God teaching you right now? What are you learning from the Lord where he has you today?
Yeah, I think kind of through this whole process, God's really been teaching me since my first trip in Malawi, the whole kind of book of 1 John 3. And, through that whole chapter, it really talks about how we should love like Jesus loved. And, 1 John 3:17, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother and sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? And I think kind of through Jesus' whole ministry, he showed his compassion for the poor and those in need. And I think if we're serious about following Jesus, then we'll be serious about caring for the needs of others. And so that's something that I hope to do in Malawi, and hope to do for the rest of my life.
He is Tad Glibert, and you're the former assistant director of operations for the Northwestern University men's basketball program. But even more than that, you're a servant of Christ, and you're living out in obedience the calling he's placed upon you, and certainly your wife, Carly. We'll be praying for you, my friend. Those listening, I hope you guys will keep praying for Tad and his wife as well as they enter into this new phase of life, going to Malawi and Africa as full-time missionaries. And keep us posted. I don't even know what kind of internet you'll have out there, Tad, but love to hear kind of how God works. But not only that, but maybe the sports connection too. I'm sure you'll be kind of doing sports stuff out there. You don't just walk away from that when you've been doing it all of your life. And just keep tabs on us. Love to know how you're doing and how everything's going out there.
Definitely. There's no internet out there, but we do have cell phones that have data, so we'll be able to post on social media here or there. And so, yeah.
That's great. Tad, thanks for being here, man. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
That was Tad Glibert. You can follow along on social media on Tad's Twitter page. It's TGLIB and then the number 2. TGLIB, the number 2. His Twitter page says, always, only Jesus. And he said, an older bro to 65 of the best kids in the world in Malawi, Africa. Tad's doing a great thing, and he's been through some storms and has come out on the other end, still knowing that God has called him to the mission field with his wife. And Carly and Tad, man, they're going to need our prayers, and believing that they're going to be able to do amazing things, bring in the name of Jesus to Malawi, Africa. And again, you can support him and Carly in any way, even just like a one-time, $5 donation or whatever. Everything can help. Any kind of monetary donation can help for Tad. And you can go to cohcommunity.org, cohcommunity.org to give and to support. COH stands for Circle of Hope. And just excited for them. I mean, by the time this podcast has aired, because we taped this in late September, they left October 1st, and they're in Malawi, Africa right now as this airs. And just believe in really great things for them and just opportunity for them to really make a difference for the kingdom through what they're doing. So many thanks to Tad for sharing his story and his journey here on Sports Spectrum. We also thank you for listening. Reach us on our social media pages as well. We are at sports_spectrum on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We're also on YouTube. You can subscribe there and become a member of our YouTube family. And definitely check out our website, sportspectrum.com. That's got all the content you need every day. Bookmark it. Check it out. Go back there just like you would ESPN or the Weather Channel or CNN or whatever bookmarked pages you go to each day. Sports Spectrum's a great place to do that. And there's articles updated every single day. Also want to direct you when you do go back to sportspectrum.com, search tag Glibert, because it'll be an opportunity for you to read the story, an in-depth story from June of 2018 about the escape that him and his wife, Carly, made from an armed robbery while they were on their African missions trip back in 2018. We actually wrote a story on that, and you can read that there on Sports Spectrum. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time with a new episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast. Have a great rest of your day.